NASA 557, contact tower 128.15.
Caution, caution. Manual, fuel, manual, fuel.
I'm John Golia.
I'm Greg Fife.
And I'm Todd Curtis.
And we are the Flight Safety Detectives.
Between us, we have over a century of aviation accident investigation and safety experience to draw on as we discuss issues that affect all of us.
So we are qualified to share our perspectives on accidents and incidents and what can be learned from them for the future.
We're proud to say that we have two sponsors that really relate to the topic of aviation safety: the Professional Aviation Maintenance Association, or PAMA, and Avemco Insurance. Later on in the show, we'll tell you how you can get a 5% discount on your insurance just for listening to the show.
We don't just dissect the official reports. In every episode, we identify safety issues and take the mystery out of accident investigations.
So maybe pilots and their planes can have safer flights ahead.
Well, hello, gentlemen. It is another episode of Flight Safety Detectives. Good to be with you guys. Today, I think we have an interesting accident that unfortunately happened outside the United States, but it has many traits in this accident that we're seeing in the United States, especially in our flight training world. And as a person who sits on the board of the National Association of Flight Instructors, and we've talked about this on previous shows, there's been a great concern over at least the last 18 months to 2 years about the increased number of flight instruction-related accidents, which at this point, plus failures or unsuccessful check rides in the piloting community through all certificates and ratings, not just specific student going to a private pilot. And in reading this particular accident, there were a lot of issues that all three of us have talked about, prior to going on the air, and we're going to get into those. But this is an accident where, like any other accident, at the end of the investigation, there should be lessons learned. There should be things that we can take from these investigations and build back into, whether it's a flight school or a particular flight operation or a particular individual, such as a flight instructor and or a student pilot. We should be able to learn some lessons so that we can move forward and that we can benefit aviation safety. This report, in my mind, was just lame. It's a bunch of words written on a piece of paper with some pictures in it, but there was nothing that came out of this report that anyone who read the report could use for feeding back into flight school or even into personal flying, other than don't do this. And it's just sad. Todd, you were the one that found it, so I'm going to turn it over to you to just introduce it to the audience.
Very good. As we've done before on the show, we've looked at reports from countries outside of the United States just to get a feel and a flavor for how they do things and how similar the events that are being studied there happen here, as Greg said. This is from the South African organization, the Accident and Incident Investigation Division of the South African Civil Aviation Authority. This report was published 4 days before we did this recording. It was published on the 13th of September, 2024. We're doing this on the 17th. This is for an accident that happened less than 7 months ago. In February of 2024, there was a Cessna 172 that was on a training flight going from an airport near Johannesburg to another local airport to do touch and go landings. And according to the report, the first 2 touch and go landings apparently happened without incident. And on the third one, there was an eyewitness who stated that they saw the airplane very low over the runway, about a meter above the runway. And after it reached the end of the runway, it made a sharp climbing turn after which it went toward the ground, and the pilot, whoever was manipulating the controls, attempted to pull out of that dive, was not able to, and they crashed near a nearby road. There was a flight instructor with roughly 270 hours total, and a student pilot with roughly 17 hours, who was a pre-solo student pilot. And the purpose of this flight, according to the report, was to go through a variety of maneuvers in preparation for the first solo. And that's where all three of us looked at this report and started scratching our heads. There were things about what were being done here for a pre-solo pilot that didn't make a lot of sense. And in fact, the report said the instructor and the student were going through some maneuvers that were ahead of the syllabus. And Greg, I think you can give us a much better and impassioned version of why this didn't make sense from a flight instructor perspective.
When you read the report and you see the elements that they've included in the report from the training manual that they're using, they're doing things in flight instruction that you wouldn't normally teach a pre-solo student. And of course, the question on this particular last leg of the flight, where the two previous legs, they touched down successfully. It's presumed that the student pilot had flown those two legs to a touchdown, to a touch and go, if you will, because again, that student was being prepped for, as a pre-solo student, for solo. On the third one, as the witness described, flying low over the runway, you know that the aircraft was also fast because it was in level flight over the runway. And the only thing that you could think of in a logical way is, okay, someone was demonstrating, either the flight instructor was demonstrating, or he asked the student, let's abort the landing. I want to see how you're going to fly if you can't land. Then the witness sees the airplane pull up into a very steep nose-high attitude and then roll off on the right wing, as it's described in the report as a wingover. Now, is this a case of the flight instructor trying to coach the student through, okay, you've just decided you're not going to land, you're accelerating, establish a climb attitude, and the student inadvertently pitches the aircraft up to an excessive nose-high attitude, and by the time the flight instructor realizes what's going on, the airplane has gotten to a stall condition, rolls off, and is heading to the ground at a low altitude that's insufficient for recovery? Or is this a flight instructor who decides he's going to demonstrate a maneuver that is not in the training syllabus and performs this high-speed pull-up to, a point, and then does an intentional wingover, trying to show the student, how good a pilot he is? I can give you two different scenarios. The problem with this report is there is no information that really is indicative or suggests one or the other. The problem with this report is the quality of the investigation, because as we've talked about, there are a lot of questions that still need answers, and it's apparent that those questions were never asked. And again, looking at this report, there's facts, they're one-line facts. Yeah, okay, the airplane crashed. Yes, it crashed in a nose-low attitude at a high rate of speed. One curious thing is the description of the flight instructor who, quote, got flung out of the aircraft during the impact sequence, and yet the student pilot was still strapped into the aircraft. Right there, it's like, okay, how did the flight instructor get flung out of the aircraft? And those are the exact words out of the report. How did the flight instructor get flung out of the aircraft? Well, I would expect that there should be some information about the seatbelt and shoulder harness. Were they used? Did they fail? Why did they fail? If they did, in fact, there's no information. That could be a critical safety of flight issue.
With
that could be a critical crash worthiness issue.
With respect to the wreckage, there are some photographs in this report although there is no detailed description of what they were seeing other than the main wreckage. For example, the flight instructor was flung out of the aircraft. Well, was the seat still connected to the cabin, or was the seat also flung out of the aircraft? No indication of that. There was no post-crash fire, which is a good thing. Doesn't tell us if they had a lot of fuel on board when this happened, or they had very little fuel. Again, this is a level of detail that was lacking here. But even more importantly, I thought to myself, this had a flight instructor on board. Was this a one-off kind of thing? Was this someone who was just casually doing instruction on his own, or was there an organization involved? Not in the report, but chasing down the registration, I found it was registered to a company, apparently a South African company, that also runs a flight school at the departure airport. Okay, if I'm an investigator, I would think, well, is this instructor A-okay? Does this instructor have anything in his or her record? Turns out there's no accident in this person's record, but this instructor only had 266 hours total. Well, what about the flight school? Do they have a record of accidents and incidents? No word on that. Is the flight school under investigation for anything? No record on that. Are there any accidents or incidents in the history of the flight school? No information on that. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, medical things. This is a fairly young flight instructor, fairly young student, but there's no indication that there was anything medical going on with either of them. And here's a portion of the report which got both of our attentions. And Greg, I'll give you the honor of reading that part about the medical examination.
Yeah, the medical examination, again, we're always concerned with the physical state of a pilot. Of course, we can't determine a mental state necessarily unless there were radio calls, things like that. But we're always looking for the physical state. We're looking for incapacitation, possible sources of incapacitation, such as drugs, alcohol, things like that. And apparently these guys were in a real big hurry to get this report out without doing a lot of investigative work. And so under the medical and pathological information, they made a statement that the post-mortem examinations of both the flight instructor and the student pilot were performed. At the time of the release of this report, which, like you said, Todd, was just several months after the actual accident, and not very many months, the results of the post-mortem and toxicology tests were not available. Well, why not? I mean, is it that they have so many people die in there that they're backlogged, or they just put this on the shelf and we'll get to it when we get to it? The statement of, should the results have a substantive impact on the outcome of this investigation, which will be considered new evidence, the Accident and Incident Investigation Division will reopen the investigation. That's never going to happen. This is done. This has been written off and off someone's desk. Let's move on to the next thing.
Greg, it sounds like it might have been done by an engineer and not by somebody with operations background, because there is a lot of focus on the physical condition of the airplane. I mean, it's multiple pages, more pages on that than there are any other single subject.
Yeah.
So maybe this was an engineering person who came out and did this investigation as a one-person investigation.
Well, the other thing, John, and again, if they make a statement in the report that there is no pre-impact, pre-existing failures or anything like that. They make a statement, the propeller was found to have separated from the hub. The engine was separated from its mountings. Examination of the propeller indicated that the engine was producing a substantial amount of power, and they send you to a figure. The amount of power produced could not be determined. If you look at figure 5 that they're referring to, any junior investigator would realize what would be the first thing you'd look for on a propeller if you want to know if it was rotating or not at the time of impact.
Yeah.
And I mean, rotating with power. What would you look at?
Well, of course, you'd look at the curl and you'd look to see if it had any fractures.
And you'd be looking for chordwise scratch marks as the propeller is turning, going into, in this case, the dirt because it hit the ground, and there's a picture of the dirt that it hit at first impact. Well, if you look at the prop is pretty well, I mean, it's pretty straight, and this is a fixed bladed prop. It's fixed pitch. There are no chordwise scratch marks on this prop. And if you look at, they characterize it as the twisted propeller indicates a substantial amount of power. I don't see a lot of twist in that propeller. And Todd, as you were talking about that witness who said the airplane pulled up into a steep pitch and then the engine went silent, or it went silent. Well, getting back to your original point that there was no fire. Well, during that real steep pitch, did they still have fuel that was being drawn to the engine? Did the engine quit because of fuel starvation, fuel exhaustion? And next thing you know, the pilot is trying to, get the airplane going back towards the runway and did a very hard over, or this wing over maneuver. I mean, there's a variety of different scenarios with questions that still need to be answered. I mean, I understand trying to get reports out in a timely manner, but they have to have some substance to them, and you have to have done sufficient investigative work to substantiate at least a reasonable and logical probable cause. Todd, I'll give you the honor. Read the probable cause.
Well, I'll have to get out my special reading glasses. This will be an especially long read. The flight instructor and the student pilot lost control of the aircraft after executing a wingover maneuver during circuit training. Okay. What does that imply? Were they both flying the airplane? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Does it say why they were doing this? Because frankly, and we spoke of this before the show, doing this sort of maneuver during a go-around procedure is not something that goes together normally, especially not something that goes together with a pre-solo training syllabus for a student pilot.
Now, read the contributing factor.
Disregard of the Hassel checklist. The Hassel checklist was a specific checklist that they had for this training organization.
The Hassel checklist. The H stands for height. Sufficient to be sure of recovery by the base height, which is normally 1,000 feet. Okay, well, that apparently didn't apply. Airframe, correctly configured for the maneuver. That is, flaps up, windows closed, correct fuel tank selected, perhaps booster pump on. Well, there is no information about this in this report about what the flap setting was or anything else. Security, straps tight and locked. No loose articles. Well, what straps? Cargo straps or seatbelt and shoulder harness? What is that all about? Engine, T's and P's good. Well, apparently they must already tell the student and the pilot what the T's and P's are. They didn't spell it out in this report or what the T's and P's are. Mixture appropriately set for the lowest anticipated height, which again, I understand what that says, and that is, how rich is or how lean is the engine going to be? Okay, that's part of this checklist. Has nothing to do with this accident. Location, not in or near controlled airspace, not above built-up areas, a suitable location. Okay, and then the final L, lookout, a proper lookout to ensure no collision risk will occur. This normally involves a minimum of 180-degree turn or 2 90-degree turns. Okay, so the contributing factor to this ridiculous maneuver of this excessive pitch up and wing over to the right, how is it that not following this Hassel checklist would have prevented, or how, if they had followed this Hassel checklist, they would have prevented this accident?
The checklist that would have been appropriate for the maneuver that was being done at low altitude is more of an air show checklist than a training checklist. Because again, like you said before, the kinds of things that they were mentioning in this report, well, they were doing these maneuvers and this is part of the syllabus. The syllabus included 45 to 60 degree bank turns, which at altitude is a normal thing. not when you're close to the ground. So even if they had done this at some point of the flight, it would have been an inappropriate procedure to do during a touch and go. Now, another
Yeah, and
thing that they didn't mention was anything about the maintenance history of this aircraft. Did it have problems, et cetera, et cetera. They did mention some key data points. This was a aircraft manufactured in 1969. That itself is not a dangerous thing, because if it's well maintained, it's not a problem. But naturally, if I'm doing an investigation, there's a 54-year-old Cessna 172. I, as an investigator, would say, well, maybe I should take a special good look at the maintenance record to make sure everything was up to date. Had a total of 17,000, almost 17,900 airframe hours on it. And again, this is an older aircraft, very likely not one that's going to have your modern complex electronic cockpit, but still perfectly flyable airplane if it's maintained properly. It would have helped me if they'd mentioned something about the maintenance.
yeah, well, the only thing they even allude to with regard to the maintenance is when the last inspections were done. And that's it. They don't talk about if there was anything that that stood out. They don't tell me how much fuel was on the aircraft during this training flight. How much did it take off with? I mean, did it had it just come back from 3 different training flights and they burned off all this gas? I mean, again, and for the witness to say, I saw the airplane climb at a steep angle, steep nose up attitude, and then it went silent. Well, what caused it to go silent? And was it because of his position relative to the airplane, or the position of the aircraft relative to the witness? Or was it, did they have an engine failure? Did the pilot pull the power back to flight idle because as soon as the airplane did a wing over and heading to the ground at a low altitude, you don't want to hit it any faster and harder than you have to. So you pull the power back to try and slow it down. And oh, by the way, if I'm heading to the ground, you know, where was the pullout started? It's obvious that, you know, the pilot apparently tried to pull out, hit the ground, and the airplane still had a lot of energy for it to move as far from the initial impact point as it did and tear up the airplane. There's no discussion about the flight training organization. That's a big concern. What kind of training? Because you got a young flight instructor, or at least a low time flight instructor, you know, approximately 300 hours of flight or of flight time, not much flight instruction time. And there's nothing about the training facility. There is nothing about this particular flight instructor. There are no references to any other students who fly with this flight instructor to say, hey, does this guy like to show off? Is he out there yanking and banking as a flight instructor? What's his, you know, story? None of that in there. And these are all critical elements, because you have a flight instruction related accident, yet you do not have a very good or even a reasonable or logical explanation as to how a flight instructor either got himself into this situation or allowed a student to get them into this situation.
Well,
And
let's
John,
talk
I
about
know,
that situation. And John, you can talk about this as well. This was not a normal maneuver close to the ground. This was a rather aggressive maneuver. It was either done by the flight instructor or done by the student. And my first response internally was, this is a showboating situation. But Greg and John, I mean, you had different nuances on why this maneuver was being done there, who was doing this maneuver, and whether the student had anything to do with this maneuver at all.
I got a little different twist on it, listening to you guys talk. Right. So we don't really know how fast, if he was accelerating when he was running down over the airport at 1 meter above the runway. If we assume for a minute that there was no change in his speed, that he was coming in for a landing, so he slowed down the cruise speed essentially, and continued that the whole length of the airport, and then pulled it up and stalled it. The stall would be that a very similar reaction, right? Falling off on the wing. If the flight instructor was not on his game, it was all over as soon as he stalled it.
Correct. Yeah, and that's why, I mean, again, for them to say that, you know, and they allude to this Shondell or wingover maneuver like it was an intentional thing. I mean, again, there isn't sufficient investigation work that has been done to even to support that idea autonomously. I mean, because like you said, I mean, the three of us can come up with, you know, 5, 6, 7 different scenarios. It's obvious that the airplane may have stalled and picked up speed, and during an attempt to recover, they were able to translate that vertical energy to horizontal energy, because after the airplane hit the ground, it still traveled quite a distance. So it's obvious that that part of the recovery had been initiated. But it's just, I mean, they show pictures of stuff. One of the railings that had detached from the airframe with forward bent signature beyond 90 degrees. What does that have to do with anything? There's no context for it. It makes no sense. It has no relevance to show a piece of wreckage like that without explaining why that is of particular why that is of particular interest. The right side wing was severed from the mainframe, and fuel spillage of unspecified amount was observed. How was it observed? I mean, was the soil wet? I mean, when I went out and did investigations like that, where I knew I had a wing separation or a breached fuel tank, I moved that wing. I would dig down in the dirt, because a lot of times, especially if the sun is out or it's warm outside, the surface is going to evaporate. But you dig down a few inches, that water or the soil is going to be saturated with fuel. I did it in snow. You know that the fuel has spilled into the snow. It stains the snow blue. You dig down to see how far down that blue goes, because you can get an idea that, okay, this was just a trace of fuel versus, this is probably several gallons of fuel. There's nothing like that in this investigation. So they're telling me they don't know how much fuel was on it. Okay, go back and find the last fueling receipt. Go find out from the flight school. Hey, when was the last time this aircraft was refueled? What's your refueling process?
And another thing that was basic, which I just realized looking at the picture of the aircraft uh, after it come to rest, I could not tell if the flaps were down or up.
Yeah.
Or maybe more specific, I didn't see anything that implied the flaps were down at all. Nothing about the flap position in the report, nothing about whether or not it was was the airplane configured for landing or for something else. But hey, I'd like to know, were the flaps up or down?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is basic accident investigation 101. And again, I mean, these are critical things to be answered, because we don't know what was transpiring with this flight instructor and this student. And is this a situation where, again, what was going on? Was this an intentional maneuver that was, in your term, Todd, was aggressive and the guy's showing off? Or did the flight instructor let this student, or did the student do something that by the time the flight instructor realized this was not good, tried to take control and salvage a bad situation? Again, those are multiple scenarios with totally different outcomes than the pilot, the flight instructor and the student lost control of the airplane doing a wingover. That just it's just sad, because there's probably some lessons to be learned across the board, whether it's with, okay, what kind of flight operation is this? Is this a one of those, pilot factories like we're seeing where they're just trying to crank people out. They don't really give them flight training. They give them enough to be dangerous and things like that. Or was this kid or this flight instructor a conscientious flight instructor and it got away from him? They delayed, he didn't intervene. I mean, all of these questions, because we're talking about them all the time on this show and in the United States with our flight training accidents. And there is a summit, a safety summit coming up in October, the middle of October. And I encourage all of our viewers and listeners to check it out. It's being sponsored by the National Association of Flight Instructors and held at Embry-Riddle in Daytona Beach. It's a 2-day safety summit, not just geared to flight instructors, even though there'll be a lot of flight instructors there, but it's open to anybody. And we're going to talk about these issues as they relate to flight training and what's going on, not only in flight training, but check rides. We're going to have a number of DPEs as speakers talking about the failure rates, because the failure rates are so high right now for all certificates and ratings. And it's because of a lack of quality of the flight training. And that quality translates into incidents and accidents. And if you do pass a check ride, and it's basically marginal, guess what's going to happen? And guess why we all have a job? Because we see reports where a brand new private pilot is gone on a long cross country with his family. Next thing you know, they're running into weather. They're trying to fly at night. They're trying to go through the mountains, VFR, at 10,000 feet through a valley that goes to 13,000 feet. Those are the kinds of things that translate into serious accidents and incidents, serious injuries or death. And we've got to try and fix this problem. We've got to figure out what the heck is going on. And now you go halfway around the world and we see the same kind of thing.
And speaking of that, it is halfway around the world from the United States. It's in Southern Africa. And South Africa has for decades been one of the leading aviation entities on the continent. So for generations, there have been operations going on there at a high level, both airline operations and others. And apparently, at least for this organization that was involved in this training accident, there's at least one large training school down there, and probably several others. And I would suspect that they draw from the region. And the cost of getting private pilots, commercial pilots, etc., might be substantially less than it would be in Europe or the States. So yes, there will be a market there for people who want to learn how to fly at flying organizations in South Africa and elsewhere. And it's up to them, just like it is up to the organizations here, to do right by their customers, to do right by the future pilots who are coming through there. It is no excuse to not do things at a high level simply because you're in country X, Y, or Z, because the sky does not care. The aircraft are made by the same manufacturers. The regulations are very similar around the world. And common sense when it comes to aviation doesn't depend on your attitude or on a latitude rather, or what continent you're in. It depends on whether or not you have the attitude of, are we going to do this right, or are you not going to do this at all?
Yeah, exactly. And again, I am critical of the process, because every accident, I don't care how simplistic it may be, every accident that is investigated, that somebody has put time into investigating, there has to be a safety benefit that comes out of it. To just go through the motions, document it, and then say, I'm done, and come up with a lame probable cause that the pilot lost control of the aircraft and, failed to recover. That doesn't tell you anything. That tells you the obvious. And for an investigator, you don't really need to leave the office to figure that out. The whole process of accident investigation is to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances. Try to figure out from a logic and reason standpoint what happened, and then backtrack and see how this whole situation occurred. Is this a systemic problem? Is it a systemic problem with flight training, with a particular flight instructor? Is it a systemic problem with the organization who employs these flight instructors? Is it a systemic problem or an isolated event? If it's an isolated event, it's easier to comprehend that, okay, yes, this pilot did something shouldn't have done. They tried to do something. They tried to show off. Okay, that's beyond the control of a flight school or a flight organization, because you got a rogue pilot out there doing something they shouldn't have done. It was just bad decision making. Versus, again, is this a known problem? If other students said, oh yeah, every time I flew with Charlie, man, every time right before we went back to the airport, we'd go out and do some sort of exotic maneuver. That's a systemic problem that the organization needed to fix. These are the things, this is the where, when it comes to trying to find those safety values or safety benefits or lessons learned out of accidents. Just to be able to record this information, put a few pictures in a report and call it good, and say that the contributing factor was they didn't follow a checklist, which really has no application at all to the context of this accident, is worthless.
Yeah, I'm listening to both of you talking. I'm just thinking to myself that we lost 2 lives here. And we always say after our accident reports about the lessons learned and the rest of it. And in this case, we've lost 2 lives and gained nothing. And it's a tragedy for their families.
It really is, because, people shouldn't die in vain. We know from all accident investigations that we've all done throughout the years, we always want to, okay, yes, these people were the unfortunate victim of whatever, value jet or whatever. But there has to be some improvement in aviation safety so that their lives meant something, and the loss of their life meant something. And it's frustrating when I read reports like this, regardless of who has produced them, where there is no safety added value.
Yep, without a doubt.
So with that rant, I will leave you with our second to the last word, Todd.
Well, to follow up on what we've been saying here, that is, these are opportunities to learn. And I say to our colleagues out there around the world, South Africa and elsewhere, challenge your organizations, whether the organization you're flying with, or in this case, the accident investigation organization, to answer your questions, to give you something that's worthwhile, something you can take away with and learn from. Don't just accept whatever is given to you and without question. If you have a question, ask it. If you don't like the answer, keep asking.
Yes.
And I was going to say, with that, John, I will leave you with our last word.
Well, folks, we certainly don't want anybody listening to our program to fall into the trap that we just talked about. But you can help yourself before you go flying. Do a good session of pre-planning. As I always say, do it twice. Do it at home. Think about it. When you get to the airport, do it again. If they don't line up, do it again. You get out to your airplane, do a good pre-flight. Touch your airplane. I keep telling people this. I just had this discussion at the airport just a week ago. Wiggle your airplane. Touch it. It helps you focus on what you're doing. When you get in the airplane, make sure you go through all the steps and check out everything inside the cockpit. After you get off the ground, put that head on a swivel, because man, there's an awful lot of people flying out there today.
Well, we just had a midair collision out in Minden, Nevada.
Right in the middle of nowhere. You can't hardly fly here. Todd will tell you, you can't hardly fly in here in the Northeast without having several airplanes in your windshield. I mean, if you don't have your head on your swivel up here, you are in trouble fast. And so keep that in mind, and please, please fly safely.
Thank you for checking out our show. We really value our listeners and subscribers. Our podcast gets ranked by you and how much you like it. So please give us 5 stars in your podcast platform.
We want to keep in contact with you. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, YouTube.
You can email the show at flightsafetydetectives@gmail.com. By the way, if you're on YouTube, we're really working on growing the channel, and it helps if you all send in comments. Please do that. and we read all the comments.
And be sure to subscribe. Remember, if you're in the market for aviation insurance, you can save 5% with Avemco just by mentioning our show. Visit them at www.avemco.com. That's it for this episode of the Flight Safety Detective. Until the next episode, fly safe.